Across the United States, World War II catalyzed the social, legal, and political conditions that would power the civil rights movements. Texas, like the nation, became a principal arena where African American and Mexican American communities transformed wartime expectations into organized demands for equality. Though entrenched conservatism, segregated institutions, and restrictive voting rules slowed change, sustained activism in the courts, at the ballot box, and in the streets gradually reshaped the state's political order and public life. In the immediate post-war years, expectations collided with reality. The post-war civil rights movement exposed the limits of Texas conservatism. African Americans and Mexican Americans hoped that wartime sacrifices would produce a double victory over racism abroad and at home. Instead, segregation, poll taxes, gerrymandering, and unequal schools persisted. Mexican Texans experienced somewhat less discrimination than African Americans because they were legally classified as white, but they still faced widespread exclusion. Even so, political footholds began to emerge. Gradual progress occurred as Mexican American political participation expanded in the 1950s, highlighted by the election of Henry B. González to the Texas Senate in 1956. African Americans faced steeper obstacles, but court decisions outlawing white primaries and poll taxes slowly widened access to the ballot. Figures such as Barbara Jordan emerged as key political leaders, eventually becoming the first black woman elected to the Texas Senate and later to Congress. Education quickly became the most visible and contested battleground. Although the Supreme Court declared segregated schools unconstitutional in Brown v. Board of Education, Texas resisted implementation. Governor R. Allen Shivers pledged to block integration, and white citizens' councils organized to prevent desegregation. In Mansfield, mob violence and state intervention delayed integration for nearly a decade. Progress remained slow until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 empowered the federal government to withhold funds from segregated schools. By 1970, most black students in Texas attended integrated schools. For Mexican-American students, legal challenges yielded somewhat faster formal change. Court decisions such as Delgado v. Bastrop ISD and Hernandez v. Driscoll ISD held that segregating Mexican-American students violated the 14th Amendment. Nevertheless, de facto segregation persisted through language tracking, district lines, and residential patterns, reminding families that formal victories did not automatically produce equitable classrooms. As the decade wore on, the struggle broadened from schools to the streets. By the late 1960s, social unrest intensified nationwide. While Texas avoided the scale of urban riots seen elsewhere, violence did erupt, including clashes at Texas Southern University and protests against the Vietnam War. Mexican-American activism also expanded, with farmworker marches, student walkouts, and the rise of La Raza Unida Party in South Texas, challenging entrenched political exclusion. These pressures reverberated through party politics. The social movements of the 1960s strained the Democratic Party's dominance in Texas. Association with civil rights and anti-war protest alienated many conservative voters, even as liberal Democrats gained influence. Sensing opportunity, Republicans capitalized on these divisions. Although Democrats retained control into the early 1970s, the groundwork for Republican ascendancy was firmly set. Meanwhile, demographic and spatial shifts reshaped the terrain of activism. Racial tensions continued to influence Texas into the 21st century, even as legal reforms and economic growth softened some inequalities. African Americans made up 11.6% of the population in 1990, a slight decline from 1945, but, reflecting national migration patterns, most black Texans moved from rural communities into booming cities. In Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, Beaumont, and Waco, urban concentration, often above 20% of the population, created new bases for political organizing and increased pressure on governments to dismantle Jim Crow. Crucially, court victories and federal statutes opened the ballot box. In 1951 and 1953, federal courts extended Smith v. Allwright to local primaries, enabling African Americans who paid the poll tax to vote in all Texas elections. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, along with Supreme Court decisions, struck down the poll tax and eliminated the last major barriers to black suffrage. As black voter registration rose, from 35.5% in 1960 to 59.1% by 1984, one person, one vote, redistricting expanded meaningful representation. In 1966, voters elected Barbara Jordan to the Texas Senate and Curtis Graves and Joseph Lockridge to the House, the first African Americans in the legislature since 1898. By 1985, 260 black office holders served statewide, including Congressman Mickey Leland. Parallel legal strategies targeted higher education. In 1945, the NAACP launched a campaign to dismantle segregated schooling at every level. When Heman M. Sweat was denied admission to the University of Texas School of Law, state leaders tried to evade integration by creating underfunded, separate institutions. The Supreme Court's decision in Sweat v. Painter, 1950, rejected that subterfuge, ordering Sweat's admission and marking a turning point for professional and graduate education. Brown v. Board deepened this transformation, but implementation lagged. In 1954, the Supreme Court declared segregated public schools inherently unequal. Governor Shivers publicly opposed the ruling and used the Texas Rangers in 1956 to block integration in Mansfield. His successor, M. Price Daniel Sr., declined to enforce new segregationist statutes, and Texas avoided the massive resistance seen elsewhere. Still, desegregation moved slowly and met persistent local resistance, revealing the gap between law and practice. Federal leverage gradually forced compliance. Many districts stalled by redrawing boundaries or repealing orders. By 1964, only about 18,000 of 325,000 black students attended predominantly white schools. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964 authorized withdrawing federal funds from segregated systems, and after Supreme Court rulings in 1969 and 1971 endorsed busing and ended evasion, Texas districts moved more decisively toward integration. Beyond schools, public spaces became a second front. During the 1950s, federal court rulings opened publicly owned facilities, golf courses, beaches, restrooms, across Texas cities. In 1954 and 1956, federal actions dismantled bus segregation, and by the decade's end, cafeterias in bus stations, airports, and government buildings were desegregated, signaling a wider rollback of everyday Jim Crow. Direct action then amplified legal gains. The nonviolent sit-in movement that began in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960 quickly spread to Texas. Students from Wiley College and Bishop College spearheaded early demonstrations, and protests soon reached restaurants, theaters, and other venues in Austin, Houston, San Antonio, and beyond. By 1963, coordinated pressure from black Texans and white allies pushed most private businesses in major cities to integrate voluntarily, a shift later codified by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and state legislation in 1969. Nevertheless, the struggle's character shifted in the late 1960s. Although Texas saw less unrest than many states, incidents like the 1967 violence at Texas Southern University and the 1970 confrontation at the People's Party the Serve headquarters in Houston exposed deep distrust between black communities and law enforcement. These conflicts hardened resistance among some white Texans and highlighted the continuing demand for equal treatment. Mexican-American veterans and professionals built influential post-war organizations. Shortly after World War II, Dr. Hector Garcia founded the American G.I. Forum in Corpus Christi to combat discrimination against Mexican-American veterans and secure benefits denied by the Veterans Administration. He became heavily involved in the response towards the discrimination against Private Felix Longoria. On June 16, 1945, a Japanese machine gunner ambushed and killed him and members of his platoon. His remains, however, would not be recovered and identified until 1949. They returned to Texas for burial in Three Rivers, halfway between San Antonio and Corpus Christi. His widow attempted to arrange his burial with the local funeral home. The director, Tom Kennedy, however, refused on the grounds that since Longoria was Mexican, and that, quote, the whites would not like it. Instead, he offered to have the wake at the Longoria home, which was in the segregated part of the town. Longoria's widow discussed the situation with Garcia, who later contacted the funeral director and received the same rejection. He called for a meeting of the Corpus Christi Forum and began sending telegrams to Texas politicians. freshman U.S. Senator Lyndon B. Johnson immediately responded. He arranged for Longoria to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery and attended alongside the family and a personal representative of President Harry Truman. The situation gained the state government's attention, which created a 5-man committee to investigate after Longoria's burial. It held hearings and concluded that the funeral director was not being discriminate. Rather, he was acting out of anger and that he had apologized for it. All but one of the committee members signed the report. The lone holdout believed that the director was discriminatory. Another member would later remove his name from the report as well, filing his own account stating that Kennedy's actions were on the fine line of discrimination. Each of the reports would eventually be pulled from the Texas House of Representatives records. Only their summaries with no documentation survives. From the 1940s through the century's end, Texas civil rights struggles advanced through a dynamic interplay of courtroom victories, grassroots mobilization, and shifting electoral coalitions. African Americans and Mexican Americans alike confronted stubborn barriers in schools, voting, and public spaces, yet transformed legal principles into lived rights through sustained pressure and organization. Although resistance, economic inequality, and periodic unrest tempered the pace of change, the cumulative effect was unmistakable. A broader electorate, more representative institutions, and a political landscape no longer defined by unchallenged segregation. By the late 20th century, Texas had become a proving ground where wartime ideals of democracy matured, unevenly but enduringly, into expanded citizenship and a more inclusive public life. From these roots, electoral mobilization accelerated. Although Henry B. González's 1958 gubernatorial bid fell short, it energized Hispanic voters. Many campaign veterans organized the 1960 Viva Kennedy movement, which evolved into the Political Association of Spanish-Speaking Organizations, PASSO. In partnership with the Teamsters, PASSO helped elect an all-Hispanic city council in Crystal City in 1963, an early demonstration that Mexican Americans could successfully challenge Anglo-political control in South Texas. Legal victories further pried open the political system. Delgado versus Bastrop, ISD, ended formal segregation of Mexican American children in Texas schools, and Hernandez versus Texas held that excluding Mexican Americans from juries violated the 14th Amendment. In the legislature, Henry B. González of San Antonio and Abraham Kazan of Laredo joined Anglo-liberals to resist new segregationist measures. As with African Americans, the abolition of the poll tax, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and court-ordered redistricting broadened electoral participation. Yet a younger generation demanded faster change and new tactics. Adopting the name Chicano, activists emphasized direct action and community self-determination. A turning point came during the 1966 farm workers' strike, which inspired a 490-mile march from the Rio Grande Valley to Austin. Governor John B. Connolly's public rebuff fueled Brown power militancy that persisted into the mid-1970s. This ferment produced both institutional and insurgent wings. Established middle-class organizations grew more outspoken while operating within traditional structures, founding MALDEF in 1968 to pursue school desegregation and civil rights litigation. Simultaneously, the Mexican American Youth Organization, MAYO, and the Raza Unida Party embraced separatist politics and directly contested Anglo power. In 1970, José Gutiérrez won a Crystal City school board seat with 2 fellow Raza Unida members. In 1972, gubernatorial candidate Ramsey Muñiz captured 6% of the statewide vote, nearly tipping the race to Republican Hank Grover over Democrat Dolph Briscoe. Although separatist energy waned, its organizational legacy endured. Internal divisions and official pressure blunted Raza Unida by the mid-1970s, but the movement trained thousands of new leaders. The Mexican-American Democrats and the Mexican-American Legislative Caucus built on that momentum, expanding Hispanic political influence across the state. By the 1980s and beyond, these efforts translated into measurable statewide clout. In 1987, Hispanic voter registration reached 47.2% of the voting-age population, amounting to just over 15% of all registered Texans. That year, 1,572 of the nation's 3,314 Hispanic elected officials served in Texas, including 25 state legislators, 4 members of Congress, and San Antonio Mayor Henry Cisneros, who later joined President Bill Clinton's cabinet. Over time, Hispanic leaders increasingly linked civil rights to bread-and-butter issues, representing communities whose median family income in 1985 at $17,435 was roughly three-quarters that of Anglos. By the 1990s and beyond, Mexican Americans and other Latino voters had become indispensable actors in Texas politics at every level. From the 1940s through the century's end, Texas civil rights struggles advanced through a dynamic interplay of courtroom victories, grassroots mobilization, and shifting electoral coalitions. African Americans and Mexican Americans alike confronted stubborn barriers in schools, voting, and public spaces, yet transformed legal principles into lived rights through sustained pressure and organization. Although resistance, economic inequality, and periodic unrest tempered the pace of change, the cumulative effect was unmistakable: a broader electorate, more representative institutions, and a political landscape no longer defined by unchallenged segregation. By the late 20th century, Texas had become a proving ground where wartime ideals of democracy matured, unevenly but enduringly, into expanded citizenship and a more inclusive public life.